talked about user stories. And then we talked about taking user stories and breaking them up into tasks. Then we talked about going back to the customer and getting the customer to prioritize their user stories for us. Because not all user stories are created the same. That seems like a pretty good deal. We took user stories and then we came up with estimates for the user stories, because some are small, some are medium, and some are sort of large. By the way, your screens in front of you have an on-off button in the lower right-hand corner. Do me a favor and click them off so that it's cold and dark in front of you. Then what we discovered is that we can take user stories and break them up into tasks, because tasks were a little bit closer to what the actual software developers have to do. And then we discovered we could re-estimate the tasks, and we would actually get a little bit closer to exactly the level of effort that it was going to take to implement these sorts of things. Then we came up with these great things that we like to call iterations. And it's not just one iteration to get the whole software put in, but rather multiple iterations, which is different from that waterfall technique, which is one iteration, but you go off into the closet for a month to be developed, and you come back, you hand it over to the customer, customer's sad and upset because it's not actually what they like to have today. But instead you're using these clever iteration things, so you did an iteration for a little while, you go back to talk to the customer, do another iteration, pop over call, that sort of stuff like that. We worked out the concept of velocity. Remember the concept of velocity? It says, hey, let's get a little bit of a real world consideration into what we're doing and stuff like that. Fantastic. So we've done all this work. We've actually completed an iteration. We talked about what we do when we wrap up iterations. We do all this sort of great stuff and stuff like that. And now we're at a point where we're saying, great, we're all done because we've had parties and we've wrapped up, and now what are we going to do next? The second question is, well, assuming that we're not done, we're going to do another iteration. Remember, in our first iteration, or our second, or whatever iteration we just completed, we got some functionality. But we didn't have enough time during that, sorry, how long is the iteration? Roughly, it's about 30 days, really about 20 working days, arguably 15 days of actual coding, something like that. Yeah, so in that month, we didn't have enough time to get everything implemented, so we got some stuff implemented, which means we have more stuff to do, which is why we're going to have another iteration. Well, if we're going to have another iteration, it sounds like we should probably do some effort planning. So today, let's have a little chat about exactly how you go about planning that next iteration. So, where do things stand right now? Well, let us keep our fingers and our toes crossed. Let us assume that the last iteration went well. Otherwise, you're on the street looking for a job, right? Okay? In which case, we don't really have to worry about the next iteration. Okay, so we are delivering working software on time. Fantastic, okay? Software development is all about change. If you get into the world of software development, the reason you get into it is because you did not want to get into the world of accounting. So the rules for accounting were worked out about 2,000 years ago. And the rules for accounting don't really change. So if you don't like change, accounting is a fantastic profession to get into, because the rules freaking don't change. Software development, we change it every couple of weeks, right? So it's all about change. So now what do we have to do to prepare for the next iteration, given that software development is all about change? Well, we're going to have to rebuild our software development status dashboard. Remember that pretty chart that shows the user stories over here? We were working on these over here, and they were all done over here, all that sort of stuff. It was great. It showed us what was going on, but it showed us what was going on last iteration. We're going to start a brand new one. Sounds like we have to get a whole brand new, cleaned off, wiped down, stripped off software development dashboard, and we work on that. And we're going to have to reset our we're going to have to adjust our user stories. So we had a bunch of user stories. Hopefully we implemented a bunch of user stories. Now we go back to the bucket. We look for more user stories. We pick those ones out and we say, these are the ones we're going to implement in this iteration. And then we're going to have to reset our expectations based on what the customer wants now. So, you know, we're dealing with customers, and customers told us back in time what they wanted, right? They prioritized all their user stories. Now what's happened is time has passed, and we are now standing here. Quick question, is it possible our customers could have changed their mind? Is it probable our customers have changed their mind, right? Now remember what's happened since then and now. You've worked really hard, and you've created great looking software, and you've gone to the customer and you've presented them with your fantastic, highly capable, partially functional software, right? And now they have that software, which means they can use it, they can run it, they can do stuff with it. Do you think that might change the way they see the world? Yeah, right? They're going to look at it and go, oh, so that's what it looks like. Now I get it. But now that I get it, I can tell you more clearly what I really want. This is great stuff. What I need you to do though, I need you to do a little bit more of this, a little bit more of this, and yeah, that other stuff, don't worry about that yet, right? So we would expect, definitely after the first iteration, to have our customer to make some fairly dramatic changes in the priorities for user stories. All right, 3 things to make working software. We want to complete an iteration scheduled work. The burn down rate indicates how well your iteration went. Remember, burn down is a little friend right here. Now this little red line indicates the ideal working rate of the people who are working on it. Ideal charts are really great. We love them a lot, but the world never works out that way. The reality of how things actually went for you was probably on either side of this line, and arguably probably mostly on the top of it. But basically what you really want to do is after, in this case, 80 days, you really like to end up here where you have it all done. Now the interesting question at the end of an iteration is, well, how did that work out? Were you able to complete your software development tasks on time? Okay? Now if you didn't end on time, but you got the work done and the customer's happy, that's cool. Don't get too wrapped up in that. Okay? Happy customers, all that really matters. Okay? Yeah. You want to be able to get it done on time. But if there's some slippage, stuff happens. Okay? And everybody's going to understand that. As long as you have a happy customer, you're doing well. Remember, your software has to pass all of those tests. And oh my God, we talk about test. But if you're passing all of them, then you can feel very comfortable that the software that you're delivering to your customer actually does what they need it to do. Okay? Now remember, we talked about tests, we talked about coverage. How much of the software that you delivered do you hope that your tests cover? 100%, of course, is the right answer. Okay. The reality is that you'll never probably have 100% of your software covered by the test cases that you have. How much are you shooting to have covered? What's the magic number here? 90 would be great. You probably won't get there. 85-ish. You can cover 85% of your code with test cases that you've written. You're doing pretty well. So what does that mean? That means that like 15% of it's not covered by any test cases. That's okay. 15% of your code probably never gets run, or gets run infrequently, or isn't really all that terribly important.
Or doesn't cause massive game for
Big blue screens of death showing up, right? Or having the airplane that's in flight suddenly goes hard. Wait, no! Okay. So how do we get all our tests? So we're talking about unit tests, we're talking about system tests, and we're talking about those incredibly cool black and white box tests. So pretty much every single test that you have available to you. And of course, at the end of the day, what really, really matters is that your customer is a happy customer. And they're going to be happy because you're providing them with functionality that they need to do something. Run their business, do their scientific experiments, track elk migration habits in northern Canada, whatever the story is. Alright, so this is our dashboard, just to sort of refresh what's going on here. Once again, over here we have all of our user stories that we want to accomplish in this particular iteration. Over here, this is the user stories that we actually have in progress. Now these actually aren't user stories, I guess I should be a little bit clearer. These are actually tasks. Remember, multiple tasks make up a single user story. As we get the tasks completed, we come over here, we start to stack them up for a little while. When we get all the tasks associated with the user story taken care of, then what happens is we go ahead and take the user story, we move it off and put it in the completed section. Up here we have, of course, the burn down charts. You can see in this one we've actually sort of charted how things went. That's pretty much what we would expect. A couple below and probably a whole bunch above. This is our next holding area, so if there's a particular user story that we're working on that for whatever reason the customer over time and events cause us to push off, we will put them here so we don't lose them, and we'll remember to incorporate it next time. And all the way down here in this lower left-hand corner, this is where things that weren't planned for this duration, but show up and we have to actually be taken care of, get put, and what will happen when they get put there, we'll start working them in, and then we push some stuff off and stuff like that. So that was our software development dashboard, our good old friend, and we're going to have to create a brand new one of these for the next iteration, right? So, what's your plan for the next iteration? You know you're going to do an iteration, but what are you actually going to do? Okay, first off, it all starts, of course, with user stories, okay? The very first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go back to your user and say, hey, listen, I've already presented you with this beautiful piece of software as part of one of my early iterations. Now let's talk about what user stories are left, and let's see if we can collectively put some priorities on it. What functionality do you want the software to do next? Now remember, you're going to find that this is going to get pretty slippery. It's going to move around a lot. One of the big things that you're going to see right off the bat, of course, is that new stories are going to be added. Once I see working software, I get a much better feel for what I really want. Because when we were talking before any software existed, it was all up in my head. But when I actually see real software, then I get really pretty specific about what I want. And what you're going to discover is that these new stories are probably going to be high priority stories. Hey, this is great. What I need, this is so close to what I need, but what I really needed to do is this, right? Okay? So you're going to have new stories being added, things are going to be reprioritized. I would expect the new stories to probably be high priority, so what's there currently is going to be pushed down the stack. So we talked about this a little bit before. You don't want to spend too much time on all of your user stories until it becomes clear that you're actually going to be implementing. Estimate them, okay, that's probably pretty cool, but then sort of stop it there. Because any more effort that you put into those user stories is probably going to be wasted because they're going to get reprioritized, first off. And you may even end up re-estimating them later on. So even the estimates, you don't want to spend an awful lot of time on. Now remember velocity, our old friend velocity. What is velocity again, if I remember?
It's an adjustment for real world problems.
The fact that your software development team is not 100% productive, right? So they will work on developing software for you, which is fantastic and wonderful. However, the reality of the situation is that they're not going to spend 100% of the time working on your particular software development project. So the question is, how much of their time are they actually going to spend on it? Remember, our rule of thumb for a starting point was, let's say, 70%. So what that means is they're going to spend 30% of their time, or 3 days out of every 10 days, they're going to spend doing something else. Filling out time cards, working on another project, going to class, who knows what the story is. Okay? But that's exactly right. But here's an interesting thing. Now that you've completed an iteration, you actually have metrics. You know how many days the people on your project spent developing software for you. Fantastic and wonderful and great and stuff like that. That means that you know what their velocity is. So you may have started with that little 0.7 estimate, which is great, but now you actually have hard numbers for the software developers that are actually part of your team. What that means is maybe you go to 0.8. Maybe they're a little bit more efficient than you would expect. Maybe you go to 0.5. Maybe they're not nearly as efficient as you were hoping that they'd be. No matter what, you'll have a much more accurate velocity value going into the next iteration because of the metrics that you're able to pull out of the iteration that you've just completed. Now we've got a burn down rate. We talked about that. Okay, we need to create a new software development dashboard, of course. We need a fresh burn down rate. Okay, and it's basically, so what that means is we have to figure out what our ideal is. You know, how many days are we going to have in this particular iteration? Remember, days is based on number of developers that you have, and of course, number of days in the actual iteration. That figures out your total number of days. Then you got to figure out, you know, sort of how that's going to work out, and you need a new velocity calculation. So basically, before you start a brand new iteration, you got a little bit of math to do to basically figure out how fast this thing's going to move along and how quickly you're going to get that software done, right? And you're doing all of this effort so you can have an intelligent discussion with your customer. You will be making promises to the person that you're delivering the software to. You really want those promises to be as accurate as they possibly can. Otherwise, you're going to be stepping on your tongue at the end of the month, and they're like, okay, 30 days is up, where's my software? Well, things took a little bit longer, we just need another 2 weeks. No, it's like, not going to work that way. All right, next user stories. Now remember, on our little clever software development dashboard, we've got that little next area for stories that we were working on and then something changed. Customer came to us and said, whoa, that's not a priority for me, put it off for now, or maybe just things got crazy out of control and we said, whoa, some of these other stories are going to take a lot more effort, so let's push those stories off to the next time. So we move those stories over, we put them over in the next area. So when you're planning your next iteration, what we want to do is take those user stories off and reprioritize them. Look, they were prioritized high enough that they were part of your last iteration. Good stuff. Okay? You would expect them to be at least high on the prioritization list going into your next iteration. In other words, you would expect that you'd probably be working on it for the next iteration. Okay? Now, as you go through all this, as you did all the testing and stuff like that, you probably found bugs. You probably found bugs that have not been fixed in the software that you actually deliver to the customer. For whatever reason, the software works good enough. Okay, so now you've got this big old honking list of unit tests, system tests, user tests, bugs that you found. You got to fix them sometime. Okay, what that means is you're actually going to have to come up with a way to, you're going to have to reserve some time to work on fixing the bugs that you have. So you have sort of a balance of things that you're going to be working on in the next iteration. Maybe something that you didn't have in your first iteration, right? You're going to have fantastic and wonderful new functionality, exactly what your customer wants to have. At the same time, you're going to have a chunk of time and effort that you're going to reserve to work on nothing but bugs. Now the challenge with that is the customer's never going to see the output of that. Hopefully, they're never going to see the output. You're going to be fixing things the software does that it's not supposed to do, which you know is a good thing, and arguably the customer knows is a good thing. The challenge is that it's not providing any additional functionality for the customer. So the customer really wants you to minimize the amount of time you spend on this, but as a good, smart, bright software developer, you know you have to get these things taken care of. Otherwise, they're going to come back and bite you later on. So the question is we have completed an iteration, fantastic and wonderful. How do we actually wrap that up? You know, do we just throw it all away and say, woohoo, next iteration? And the answer is no. There's things to be learned and things to be remembered from the iteration that you just got done with. So the simplest way to go about doing this is if you take a photo of your software development dashboard that you had from last time before you erase it. Okay? You're really trying to capture three things. These are the types of questions that you might come back in the future and ask yourself. The first one was, how much work did you actually plan on doing? It doesn't mean that you got all that work done. It doesn't mean that you were planning on doing it, though. So that goes to the next question. How much did you actually get done? You would hope that these are the same thing, right? I planned to do this and I got all that done. It doesn't always work out that way. Remember, we got that whole next area where we move stuff off. Remember, there's also other stuff that you haven't planned on that may have come in and bumped some stuff off. Okay? And then any of the user stories that we moved into the next, we now have to move back into the iteration piles that we consider. We don't want to lose any of our user stories. We're working on them, we put them off for a while, that's fine, we've got no problem with that. But now we want to make sure that they get worked back into our consideration for what we're going to be working on next time. Things to do at the start of a new iteration. All right. Okay? Revise both your story and your task estimates. Remember, each one of the user stories that we're working on, we've come up with an estimate for. That's going to take 5 days, 10 days, 15 days, 40 days, however long it's going to take. We have a number associated with each one of our user stories, which is great. But we also determined that those user stories are written in a language that's pretty close to the customer, which is great, but from a software development point of view, we're down here. Okay? So generally what we end up doing with those user stories is we break them up into specific software tasks. Great. Now I've got 4 tasks that relate to one user story. What I then have to do is go ahead and estimate each one of those tasks and say, listen, from a software developer point of view, what's my level of effort of implementing each one of these? Remember, we've talked about this before. I could sum up the estimates for all those tasks, and the number may be different than the number I had for the user story. That's fine. Chuck the user story estimate, go with your task. Yes. Okay, we have to revise our velocity. Remember, the velocity that we used last time is probably going to be different from the velocity we used this time. We probably used 0.7. Now we're going to use the hard data that we collected from the last iteration to actually go ahead and calculate a new one. And ultimately, the reason that we're going through the level of doing all this math work is that what we want to be able to do is provide our customer with estimates that we really believe in. Look, I mean, dear God in heaven, they really are estimates, right? So they are made up, okay? And everybody understands that. But what we want to do is we want to be as accurate as we possibly can. You recalculate your estimates, you recalculate velocity at the start of every iteration, applying what you've learned from the previous iteration. So look, we have that iteration done, we had the party, we wrapped it all up, but it turns out that coming out of that last iteration that we just got done with, there's some important values that we use when we're planning the next iteration. Okay? So although it's done and it's in the bag, so to speak, it has some value that it can provide to us going into the future. So how do you use velocity? You apply velocity to the amount of work that you have to do in order to get a realistic work. Okay, so this is real world stuff of how long it's going to take you. So we start out with the number of days of work that we have to do, because we know that from all of our task estimates. We divide it by our velocity, okay, go at 0.7, 0.6, 0.8, whatever that happens to be, and we'll come up with the days required to get the work done. Now remember, if our iteration is 30 days-ish, okay, or even 20 days for that matter, then we know this answer. And we know our velocity. So really the only thing we're playing around with here is days of work. And days of work is based on just adding together the estimate for the tasks. So if I know these two values, what I'm really doing is I'm playing a game here and saying, how much can I get done during this next iteration, right? 30 calendar days to 20 working days, turns out to be probably about 15 days of work. All right, let's play a little math game here, make sure we're all on the same page here. Let's plan our next iteration. We're going to start with some assumptions. We're going to say that we have 3 software developers. Woohoo! Okay? And we know that it took us 38 days to complete our last iteration. Okay, so we've actually spilled over. We've been planning on doing 30, it took us like another 8 days for whatever reason. All right, so the very first thing we're going to do is calculate our new velocity. So we take the number of days that it took us to complete stuff last time. We take the number of work days in the month and we times it by the number of developers. We say 38 over 60 comes out to be 0.6 is what our velocity value is going to be. Now if you're looking at that, you're going, well, what velocity did we use last time? And we're going to say that we probably used 0.7 last time. Now it's changed to 0.6. What does that tell us?
What's worse?
We've got the laziest software developers in the entire universe. Okay, no, that's not true. This is actually fairly realistic, right? So basically, our productivity is not as high as we assumed it was last time. But this is good. At least we know it. As we like to say, we're going in with our eyes wide open. Because now we go down here and we say, hey, calculate the number of work days available. So we take the number of developers, we multiply it by the work days in a month, we multiply it by our new velocity, 60 times 0.6, comes out to be 36 days. So with our 3 developers, we have 36 days of development that we can accomplish in the next month. This is a critical value to know. Because now what I can do is I can go back to all those tasks I have, and I can start saying I'm going to do this task, this task, this task, and when I hit 36, I'm done. I will not be able to get any additional work done in this iteration. And so I better not be making any promises as far as when I'm going to be able to deliver. All right, wrap up here. All right, so when we're planning the next iteration, we always want to check with the customer to make sure that this is the work that they want. Customers are notoriously fickle. What they told you at the start of the last iteration was accurate then, but time has passed and you are here right now. Do you think their thoughts may have changed? Almost guaranteed. Somehow, now their world is different, your world is different, they know different things. They have probably changed what they want. So it is your responsibility as a software developer to go back and have a chat with them, find out where they're at. We need to recalculate the velocity at the end of every iteration. Remember what we're doing is we're reaching into the past, we're reaching into the metrics that came out of the last iteration that we did, we're applying them to where things stand right now, and we're calculating the velocity that we're actually going to be using as we go into the future. We need to let our customers reprioritize our user stories. What used to be really important to them last time may have dropped. And remember, we've talked about this, once the customer sees your software for the first time, there's a very, very good chance that all of a sudden, they're going to go, oh, there's a bunch of new things that I just thought of that I'd like to have, and those are probably going to be higher on their prioritization list than all the other things that are currently there. So it's really good to have that discussion with them. No matter whether or not you're using your code, or whether you've been dropped onto a project and took over somebody else's, or whether somebody showed up and dumped a bunch of code on you, you have to remember that it's just software. Your process for developing the software is always exactly the same. So if you get a bunch of code dumped on you, hey, that's interesting, that's fabulous. You know you got to do testing, you know you got to do estimates, you know you got to do prioritization, et cetera, et cetera. You need to have at least one user story for each piece of your code. The one thing that you don't want to have is a bunch of code that you don't know why you have. Because all of a sudden you've got code that you're responsible for, that you have to maintain, that you have to understand what it does, but if you don't understand why you have it, then that gets to be pretty expensive pretty darn quick. When you're reusing code that somebody else has given you or that you've taken over and inherited, never make any assumptions about it. People might tell you what that code does. Oh yeah, that does a bubble sort. But until you actually see it work, I urge you not to trust it. You know, yeah, maybe it does it, but maybe it has some artifacts, or it does something else, or maybe it checks with the database. Who knows what the story's going on? You got to check that code out. Anytime you inherit something like that. All of your code needs to be readable, reliable, and easy for others to understand. You know, wherever you are in your software development career, you have hopes and dreams and aspirations of moving on to someplace else. And when you move on to someplace else, somebody else is going to take over the code that you're working on right now. And you had better make it readable, reliable, and easy for others to understand. Otherwise, you're going to get a bad reputation, right? I do not want to touch his or her code because I know it is trash. I'm not going to spend a month coming up to speed trying to understand what they were doing when they created it. All right, so what did we cover today? We covered the 3 things that make working software. Seems like that's relatively important. We talked about how you're going to go about planning your next iteration. Remember, you've completed 1 iteration, you've wrapped it all up, and that's great and wonderful, but you've got more iterations to do, and it turns out that the last iteration you just completed had a lot of important information that you're going to use as you calculate how you're going to do your next iteration. We talked about how you actually wrap up the iteration that you just completed. It has valuable information that you may need in the future, so let's make sure that we don't lose that. And we talked about recalculating your velocity, because your velocity really determines how much work you're going to be able to get done and what kind of time period during your next iteration. Fantastic. Whatever shall we talk about next time? Oh my gosh. Next iteration part 2. That must mean that there's more to talk about on the next iteration. Interest on 30. So we'll talk about that next time. We're going to talk about a little bit of Python next, and this time we're entering the brave and scary world of files. So while we plan on coming back in 15 minutes, so that'll be about 5 till.